Welcome to the Brother Henry and You Show. I am your host, Henry Harris. Brother Henry and You Show. I am your host, Henry Harris. It's such an honor to be here today with you. We have an amazing program for you today. Today we are honored to have Kerry, Connelly, and Bryana, Clover with us on our show today to talk about her book, Wait, Is This Racist? A Guide to Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. And I want to express my gratitude and thanks for both of you being on the program today.
Thank you for having us. Yes, we wish Josh could be with us, our co-author, but he was busy.
Hello to Josh.
Hey, Josh.
Before we get started, I'm going to ask some questions. And if both of y'all want to dialogue back and forth in between both questions so I can get your perspective on it, that would be very appreciative. But before we get into the questions, would Kerry, starting with you, would you give us a little background on what you do and who you are? And then
Sure.
I would like Bryana to do the same.
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Kerry Connelly, and I guess pertinent to this work, I started writing a blog called Jersey Girl Jesus quite some many years ago, and I was really struck when I wrote about things like the Take a Knee movement and other issues of justice. I was really struck by the vitriol with which a lot of predominantly white Christian men responded to my blog. And when I realized what I was kind of dealing with there, I decided I needed to go to seminary because, you know, some of us need more letters after our name than other people in order to have as much clout. And so I realized I needed to go to seminary. And while I was at seminary, I really began to study liberation and womanist theologies. And I heard an episode with Krista Tippett, On Being with Krista Tippett, in which she interviewed Ruby Sales. And Ruby Sales talked about, she said, I know that we need I know that we have a Black liberating theology, but what is the white liberating theology? And that led me on this journey of, and that's what led to my first book, which is Good White Racist. And then that led to the second book, which is Wait, Is This Racist? And since then, I have learned as a coach and a consultant, I've worked with churches and with individuals and organizations, predominantly white people who are beginning the work of their racial deconstruction. And that's essentially about me. What about you, Bree?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Jersey Girl Jesus, because that's how I found you, and that's how we
funny.
years ago. But Bryana Clover, and I grew up in the United Methodist Church, originally from Michigan, and I spent the first 13 years of my career in agribusiness, in marketing and strategy work. But along those, for fun on the side, I was very much involved in the church. And when my husband and I, about 6 years ago, moved to Raleigh area, I became more active in the church around creating spaces and facilitating dialogue on the role of the church in perpetuating racism, and then also the so what now what is the church's role in dismantling the very structures that they were involved in creating. And I found that a lot of my work, I found myself frustrated working with predominantly white congregations, because a lot of times the work really centered individual stories of white people around their awakening to the realities of racism. And what I found was missing was a commitment and an honoring of those who identify as Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hispanic, people of color in the church, those experiences, and a true commitment to doing the individual work and the internal work required for churches to then authentically engage in it externally. And so that really, that alongside often being the only white women in the room, in the corporate world, really, created a spark within me to lean into this work on a full-time basis, but also focusing on the important work of racial healing for particularly women of African descent, but I would say all women of color who live in an American context, to really discovering their true divinity, and engaging and committing to spiritual practices of healing that they might not have learned in the predominantly white church. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what led me to the work, and was so honored when Kerry reached out to say, hey, I would love your voice to be in this piece of work. It's been an exciting journey, and it feels almost surreal that our words are out there for others like you to pick up and to be to this conversation. So thank you, Henry.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's an honor to have both of you here. I was telling them before the broadcast started that I was on Facebook one night and the book came up, and I was telling Bryana, Kerry, before you came on, that when I saw it originally, I literally took my hands and did this. And I had to rub my eyes in disbelief, not in disbelief, but like, I was like, I couldn't believe that racism and church was in the same space. Mm-hmm. And then again, that reality hit me that some people don't even believe it exists at all. And the book is just amazing, and I would recommend especially every pastor to get it. Mm-hmm. Because it'll make it answered a lot of questions for me, but also it'll make you question, maybe the board members or the structure of things or how we got things set up. The traditionalism of things. And that's just what I've learned from the book. I think it's a good book. So what inspired you to write the book? And like I said, if Bryana want to kind of interject with that too, I'm fine with that. So what inspired you to write that book? Why white is this racist?
So I think first and foremost, the church as an institution is in a very unique position. First, because we have so much repenting to do as an institution, because the construct of race would not exist. It would not exist if it wasn't for the church. Historically, the church is 100% responsible for the colonization of lands and people all over the globe. They made it possible. They affirmed it for European governments that wanted to do that kind of thing. They affirmed and condoned violence and against indigenous populations. They condoned human trafficking of enslaved Africans. And so we have as an institution, we have a lot of repenting to do, and we haven't done that yet. And also, I believe that for white people, there is a soul wound. Racism, pseudo-supremacy, white pseudo-supremacy is a soul wound that white people need to address. And I think it's a matter of urgent pastoral concern among white churches. So this book is really intended for predominantly white churches who want to and are ready to do this work, and who may not recognize the ways that they are participating in the status quo of systemic racism. And this book is designed to kind of help them recognize that. So, Bri, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was beautifully said. And I feel what really inspired me and was excited about this vision that Kerry had for this book was I hadn't quite heard of anyone particularly name the importance of the healing that white people need to do, of addressing that soul wound that Kerry calls it. And I think that that's often missing in the context of anti-racist work in the white church. And I think that there is a potential for even more harm to be done if churches aren't addressing it from that understanding of it starts with understanding that white soul wound and healing that. I know for a while, at least, I think it's a little bit different now, but churches use that term reconciliation. But what was missing from that was the repentance piece, that you can't have reconciliation if you aren't repenting. And if you aren't grieving the lie, of race as a social construct and the lie of white pseudo-supremacy. Like there is a grieving process that's involved in that too. So I just really loved Kerry's vision for really addressing that in an authentic, and she just has a way of like telling a story that is so important to be heard, but often is met with such resistance. And I think that there's a really good balance of, the reality, the hard stuff, and also grace and love. And so I wanted to be part of that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And Josh I'm sorry if I may, I just want to say that Josh and Bree's voices in this book are so important because they bring into the book the voice of those people that the church has historically and systemically oppressed, right? And they're helping to bring their experiences, not just their experiences, but also their expertise, because both of them are consultants in the church world. They are professionals. They are, they bring a perspective that white people probably have never really considered. And so it was really important for them to be included in that book as well.
That's awesome. I think you all are brilliant.
Thanks.
You mentioned something. I may go off script a couple of times, and sometimes I develop questions as someone is talking. You said something about churches coming to a understanding of it. What if? How do they do that? Like especially if it's a church that don't believe that racism don't exist, or whatever the case may be. But how can a pastor, overall, if he's ahead of the church, I would assume it would start with him. Like, that's why I say I think this book would be great for different churches and ministries in that area. But when you said something about churches coming to an understanding of it, I was just thinking, I was like, how can they do that? How can they address it?
Yeah, thank you for that. You bring up a really good point, which I think both we've really tried to address in the church, which in the book rather, which is that first and foremost, it has to start with leadership, because the truth is that within the realm of anti-racism work, number one, I kind of see it as two tracks. On the one hand, there is the anti-racism work that Bree is wanting to lead, which is, and I'll let her talk more about that, which is the healing for BIPOC, BILPOC people, right? That's the work that they are doing. For white people, our work is to heal this soul wound, right? And so we do need to center whiteness. A lot of times you hear in the anti-racism discourse, we hear we need to stop centering white people. And this is true, we do. However, because whiteness is invisible to white people, and that's why so many people don't believe that racism exists, we do need to center whiteness, the behaviors of whiteness for a while, for white people, and say, look at this. We need to look at the way we behave, the thoughts, the biases, the beliefs, the narratives that we have, and we need to deconstruct them. And I'll be honest, as somebody who has been on church staffs and been in leadership roles in churches, I understand the pressure of leadership. And I know that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I cannot wait to lead my people into this deep midnight of the soul of lament and repentance. It's going to be so much fun. Like, no leader wakes up and wants to do that. But that is the work that a white leader needs to do. And a true leader can't go somewhere or can't lead people where they have not yet gone themselves. And so the work has to start with church leadership first. And in fact, when Bree and I consult with churches, we tend to say, we're going to take your leadership through a 6-month program before we take the rest of the church through a program, because you need to go there first, right? So it's really important that any leader in this realm is doing the work internally first. Bree, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't really, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the work of BILPOC, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hispanic, and people of color in this work, because oftentimes, growing up in the church, I very much felt love, from my church family. But I also never saw Jesus depicted as his true ethnic heritage. I imagined God as a white man. And that is, in the stories that I never saw my father in in any space where I was learning about the mission of Jesus and what it looks like and what it feels like to be a Christian. And so I think there's also a deconstructing a little bit that has to happen of a reimagining of, what one's faith looks like, what one's spiritual practices look like, what one's idea of the divine looks and feels like. And I don't think that as people of color in predominantly white congregations that we are ever exposed to the resources and the mentorship that's required for that process, because it often can feel isolating and lonely. And so just to add that to your work, I think that there is absolutely that leadership space. And then there's also a need for empowerment of those leaders of color in these spaces, and oftentimes just giving them the language, naming the problem. Like you mentioned, Henry, it's like you had to rub your eyes when you saw, is this book for real? And I feel seen, I feel heard. And I feel like that's power, that's very a powerful gift to bring. To just,
and I think also, Bree, to your point about bringing, having BILPOC in spaces of leadership in the church, the white people in white churches were like, yes, because diversity, and now we're going to have our token Black person that we can point to that says we're diverse, right? And so one of the things that we try to talk about in our book is how to not do that, to not do that in a way that is tokenizing, but rather to truly create a space that is healthy and safe for BILPOC to truly be having influence and power within the church structure, within the structure of the church, because that can be a really dicey place, because one of the first places that white people want to jump to is diversity. They say, oh, diversity, that's the end goal. I don't actually believe that. I think you can be a completely white church and be completely anti-racist and understand that maybe Black and brown people need their own spaces, and that's okay, right? And that doesn't mean that we're off the hook. We still have to do our work.
Yeah, well said.
That's awesome. I love the subtitle. The subtitle says A Guide to Becoming Anti-Racist Church. Do you think or suggesting that there are some churches that are racist?
Bree, do you want to start?
That's a really good question, and it's somewhat of a complicated answer. And I say that because when the everyday person thinks about race and racism, they immediately go to individual racism, individual acts. Well, I can't possibly be a racist. If I'm a good person, I can't possibly be racist. And it shuts down any kind of helpful dialogue around the work. So I like to start with first that race is a social construct. And while none of us in today's society are responsible for creating that construct, we very much are responsible for perpetuating it, noticing when we perpetuate it, and finding ways to dismantle that within ourselves and within our institutions. So I would say, because of the historical context around race and racism and the role that the church played in that, very much if you are an institutional church and you are in an American society, and I would say, of course, we could have another conversation about racism is actually a global issue, then you are inherently racist, whether that is in your policies, and the book goes through all areas of the church, in the music that you sing, in the way that you do your missions work, in how you teach about Jesus in the classroom and what kind of representation is there. So I would say all churches have work to do in this area. I'm curious what you would say, or what you would add, Kerry.
So I'll say that, yes, there are absolutely some churches that are racist, are I think there are a few. They're not all churches, but I do think that there are some churches that practice a sort of Christian nationalism that are perfectly fine with being white and racist. Those are not the churches that this book is for. This book is for those churches that intellectually believe that racism exists and that it's wrong and that they want to do something about it. And often, one of the reasons that I really started, the spark that caused me to write this book was doing book clubs for Good White Racist. The question that I always came to was, what do we do? What do we do now that we have this? Now that we know that racism is a problem, what do we do about it? And so I think that this church is for those churches that tend to be progressive. They tend to be churches who are filled with white people who say they care about this and have not yet done the work, again, to Bree's point, both internally, because there's three different levels that racism can occur on. There's individual, within the psyche, within the self; interrelational, which is my relationship with Bree, my relationship with you, Henry, and then there's my relationship to the world, the structural, the systemic, and the cultural, right? And so understanding our role in each one of those layers, right? That's going to be the work that we can do in the church, while also addressing the systemic ways that are the status quo, the mechanisms, the operations, the day-to-day way we do church, hiring practices, songs we sing, like Bree said, children's curriculum, noticing where supremacy and whiteness is at play in all of those areas is something that not a lot of people are paying attention to. And that's what we're trying to do. Again, we're trying to center whiteness for those churches so that they can go, oh, wow, I did not see how that was perpetuating the systemic racism in the institutional church. And now we know how to do something about that.
Wow, that's amazing. So, what is your definition of racism as it relates to the book?
That's a great question. I would say racism is any activity, any inherent bias, any operational practice that perpetuates the status quo and maintains the system of imbalanced power and privilege.
You go, girl.
Systemically. What about you, Bree? What do you think?
Yeah, I'll break it down just a little bit more because I think actually that was beautifully said. What I teach a lot in my workshops is we start with prejudice, right? Which is a belief about a group of people based on their social status or the way they look or whatever. And then there's discrimination when we act upon those prejudices. And all of us have prejudices and all of us discriminate. When it really becomes like what we're talking about here is oppression. And oppression is when when that discrimination is backed by institutional power. And so I think that that's kind of a helpful way to talk about how when we talk about race and racism, we're not talking about prejudices. And we talk, I don't know if we mentioned this in the book too, Kerry, but we talk a lot with my clients around reverse racism. I hear that a lot. Well, and it's like, okay, no, what we're talking about is a little bit deeper than that surface level understanding of a simple prejudice. And I would argue no prejudices are harmless, but we're really talking about that institutional power. And there has to be a rebalancing of that power. And I think that that's a little bit about what we discuss in the book.
I think it's really important because I think that term reverse racism is something that's going to spark a lot of it's going to make some people feel something, right, when we say that. And so I think it's important to give an example of what you mean when you say that racism is privilege backed by institutional power, right? And so the one that I will often use is that as a white-bodied woman, I am at this intersection of both being oppressed by white men and also being the oppressor of so many other people, right? And the very real truth is that if I wanted to, and this is a very uncomfortable truth, but if I wanted to, if I was walking down the street and I passed a Black man, for example, if I wanted to, I could really cause that man to have a very bad day just by dialing three simple numbers, 911. And then I will have an entire system of justice that would back me up, most likely, that would back me up. And not without question, putting that man's body in actual, very real harm's way. It could become very quickly a life and death situation. That is power. And that's why reverse racism it's not really a thing, because the reverse is not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the ways that I like to talk about that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So if the church doesn't address this in present time, what will the church look like 100 years from now?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I honestly think that I think that this is such a matter of such urgent pastoral concern that if the church does not address it, I don't think the church will exist as we know it right now, because I think that this is it's touching every single aspect.
It shouldn't even be happening in church. That's the thing.
It shouldn't be happening anywhere.
Anywhere,
and
yeah,
especially
anywhere, yeah.
not the church. Correct.
I mean, when I think of church, I think about love, inclusive, accepting, validation, affirmation. Like race. That's why I said when I look at the book, it had races in church. I was like, whoa.
That's what church should be. That's what church should be. Right. I agree.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts, Bryana, with the question I had just asked?
I agree with Kerry. I mean, I think that this is I don't think I have anything else to add. I think that we need to reimagine, the church and the role. And maybe that does mean a little bit of crumbling before there is something new that can come about. And I believe in the church. That's why I do this work. I believe in that vision that we have of an all-inclusive sisterhood and the beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about many years ago. I believe that that's possible, but not if we don't address this important work. And the other thing too is there's freedom on the other side of this. I think that we don't understand, it is scary. I'm not trying to diminish that. This work does feel scary because it's a crumbling or a dismantling of one's identity as an institution and individually. But until we recognize that, our liberation is tied up in the liberation of others, and until we recognize that the end of this on the other side is liberation and freedom. If we can hold on to that, I think it makes this work a little bit easier in the sense that this is work we have to do. There is no choice. We come to this table knowing. Yeah.
I love that. And, just to add on to that, there's a guy that I follow, Andre Henry. You may be aware of him. He's an activist. He just came out with a book called All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. And he one time tweeted something that really gave me pause as a white-bodied person. He said, I don't understand how white people can be involved in anti-racism work. Doesn't it equate to self-annihilation? And when I really sat there and I was like, ooh, especially doing the work that I do. My first book had already come out, and I was like, ooh, that's a hard question, harsh, man. Ooh. And as I thought about it, I'm like, he's right. It does. That's exactly what it requires of white people. It does require a sense of self-annihilation. And didn't Jesus tell us that we need to die to ourselves, right? That's what we have to do. We need to do that complete work of deconstruction. But here's the thing. One of my, I'll be honest, she was my least favorite seminary professor, but she was still really good. And because I had amazing seminary professors, but she one time said something so profound. She said, I get that you guys are all going through this massive deconstruction of your faith, but once you get to the bottom of the deconstruction, keep going. Don't just stop there, because we have to rebuild something. And that's what we are trying to do and trying to lead white people. We need to reimagine a new way to be white in the world. That's the work that we're doing. What is this imaginative edge that we are dancing on that will show us a new way to be in the world that is different from how we are now. So that's really what we're pointing to. And that has to be the work of the collective. It's not just up to me or Bree or other one or two people. It's up to all of us.
That's awesome. I think this has been a wonderful interview. And I want to thank you, Bryana, and thank you, Kerry, for coming on the show today. I would like to highly recommend this book, especially to pastors that may be watching. You can go to Amazon.com or visit KerryConnelly.com to order the book. I believe it will bless you and it will benefit you. It'll make you ask a lot of questions as it may. I kind of saw myself in the book. I mean, being an African American with certain situations and circumstances I've been in, where it makes you really look into the mirror of your own heart as it relates to racism and things like that. And it saddens me that this exists, because I often say that when I came into the world, I didn't ask to be African American. I had no choice. So I don't understand racism. And my daughter, she's biracial. So so that's just something I could never understand, especially in the religious world, the religious institution, the church, where it most certainly shouldn't be happening. So I would like to encourage everyone to go order that book, and I believe it will help you tremendously, and it will revolutionize your world. I want to say thank you once again for y'all coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having us. It was so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too.
We hope you have enjoyed today's program. We want to connect with you. Visit us at facebook.com/The Brother Henry and You Show, or visit us on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Henry Harris 100. We're so grateful you tuned in today and hope you have a fantastic day.